The snow had stopped falling by the time the men reached the ridge, but the wind had not stopped moving it. They came expecting to dig through a collapsed roof. Someone had said it out loud back at the church 3 days before the storm, not as a threat, only as a fact, the way men state facts when they want to sound sorry before anything has even happened. A woman alone. A boy barely old enough to carry a full bucket. A shelter cut into a hillside like something out of an older, harder time. The kind of dwelling nobody in this county had built in almost 20 years. Nobody expected to find a fire still burning. The first thing the men saw was smoke, a thin gray thread rising almost straight up from a low mound of frozen grass and earth, rising the way smoke rises from a house that has never once gone cold. Behind the smoke, half buried under 3 days of drifted snow, a door stood shut but not blocked. No collapse. No dark hole where a roof used to be. Just a door and a path someone had shoveled that morning, already filling in again at the edges. One of the men, a rancher who had said plenty about this hillside back in October, stood there long enough that his horse shifted under him twice. Then, from somewhere below the frozen grass, came the sound no one in that search party had been ready to hear. A child laughing. Not the thin, exhausted laugh of someone who had survived something. The easy laugh of someone who had simply been warm the whole time. The rancher did not knock right away. He stood a moment longer, looking at that thread of smoke, at the shoveled path already disappearing under new snow, thinking about everything he had said in October about a widow who dug into a hill instead of building a proper house like everyone else. He was about to find out exactly how wrong he had been. What he did not yet understand was how she had known, weeks before the blizzard even had a name, exactly where in that hillside the wind would refuse to go. If you are watching from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where you are in the comments below. Stories like this survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier stories like this one matter to you, subscribing helps keep them alive. Agnes Kellerman had buried her husband on a Tuesday, in ground that was still half frozen underneath, in a spring that had come early enough to melt the surface snow, but not early enough to soften what lay beneath it. Wilhelm had come west with her 3 years before, full of the kind of confidence that men carry when they have never yet lost anything that mattered. He had cleared the first acre himself, built a cabin with green lumber that would warp and gap within 2 winters, and promised her that the second spring would be easier than the first. He was right about very little else, but he was right about that. The second spring was easier for exactly 9 days before the fever came through the county and took him in 11 more. She remembered the numbers because grief, she had learned, does strange things to a person's memory. She could not always recall what he had said to her the morning he proposed, back in the old country, but she could recall with total clarity that the fever lasted 11 days, that Peter had just turned 3, and that the doctor from the county seat had charged $4 to tell her there was nothing left to be done. What she was left with was 160 acres of prairie soil, a boy too young to help and too old to simply carry everywhere, a cabin already leaning slightly toward the northwest from wind that never seemed to blow from anywhere else, and a pocket watch that had stopped the same week her husband did, though she had never been entirely sure whether that was coincidence or simply a watch that needed winding. She did not throw the watch away. She did not fix it either. It sat on a shelf near the stove, stopped at 17 minutes past 4, and she found herself glancing at it some mornings, the way a person glances at an old wound to make sure it is still there. The neighbors were not unkind, not at first. They brought food for the first few weeks, the way people do when a death is still new enough to feel like an emergency. Elsie Voss brought bread twice. The Reverend Whitcomb came by to offer prayers, and, more usefully, to help Peter chop kindling for an afternoon. though the boy was really too small to be much help, and both of them seemed to understand that the chopping was mostly an excuse to sit together in the yard. But sympathy in a farming county has a season, the same as everything else, and by the time the first real heat of summer arrived, most of it had already passed. What remained was simpler and colder than sympathy. People began to ask, quietly at first and then less quietly, what a widow with one small boy intended to do with 160 acres. She could not possibly work alone. Agnes did not have an answer for them yet. She only knew that the cabin leaned a little further west every month, that the wind found new gaps in the green lumber walls almost weekly, and that whatever answer she found would need to come before the county's short window of good weather closed for good. The offer came from Harold Voss on a Sunday afternoon in late August, delivered with the particular gentleness men use when they believe they are doing something generous. Harold owned the largest spread in the county, nearly 600 acres running along the good bottomland by the creek, and he had a reputation for being fair in his dealings, which was true, and for never making an offer that did not also benefit him considerably, which was also true. He rode out to the Kellerman place with his wife Elsie beside him in the wagon, and he made a point of removing his hat before he spoke, which Agnes noted, because men who remove their hats before delivering bad news usually know exactly what they are doing. He told her, kindly enough, that he understood how hard it must be. A woman alone with a young boy heading into a third winter without a husband to bring in the harvest or cut the wood. He said the bank had only mentioned, that there was still an outstanding balance from equipment Wilhelm had purchased the year before he died, and that balances like that had a way of growing heavier in winter when a farm produced no income at all. Then he offered to buy the land. Not all of it, he clarified, just the northern 100 acres, at a price that both of them understood was considerably below what Harold himself would have demanded from any other seller in the county. In exchange, he said, Agnes and Peter would be welcome to stay on in a small house near his own property, under his protection, for as long as they needed. Elsie Voss said nothing during the entire exchange, though Agnes noticed her studying the leaning cabin wall with an expression that was harder to read than her husband's. Agnes thanked Harold for his concern. She did not accept the offer, and she did not refuse it outright either, because refusing it outright, she understood, would only confirm what half the county already suspected, that she was too proud to survive out here and too stubborn to admit it. What she said instead was that she intended to see how the place did through one more winter before she decided anything permanent. Harold nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer, put his hat back on, and told her the offer would remain open. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that the bank did tend to grow less patient once the ground froze, and there was no more harvest coming in to show good faith. He rode off without saying anything cruel. He did not need to. The math had already been laid out clearly enough, and both of them understood that the coming winter would decide far more than whether the cabin's northwest wall held through another storm. Agnes spent the better part of 2 weeks walking her own land as though she had never seen it before, which, in a way that mattered, she had not. She had spent 3 years looking at the property as a farmer looks at land, measuring it in acres of wheat and pasture for the 2 milk cows Wilhelm had left behind. She had never once looked at it as a person looking for shelter, the way her grandmother back in the old country might have looked at a hillside, sizing up not what it could grow but what it could hold against. There was a rise of ground along the eastern edge of the property, a low hill facing away from the prevailing northwest wind, the same wind that had spent 3 winters working its way into every gap in the cabin's green lumber walls. She noticed, walking it in the early October mornings, that the frost lingered longest on the western face of that hill and disappeared fastest on the eastern slope, even on mornings when the rest of the yard stayed white until nearly noon. She noticed something else, too. The dog, an aging mixed breed named Fritz that Wilhelm had brought with him from the old country, had stopped sleeping in the small wood shed near the barn sometime in September, and had instead taken to curling up against the base of that same eastern slope. In a shallow depression the animal seemed to return to deliberately, night after night. Agnes did not believe the dog understood anything mystical about the hillside. She believed, and would later be proven correct, that Fritz had simply found the one spot on the property where the wind could not reach him, and the ground held a little more warmth than the open air, and that any creature with enough sense to feel cold would eventually find its way to the same place. She had heard of earth lodges before, structures cut directly into a slope with the hillside itself, forming 3 walls and part of the roof, covered over with sod and grass. Her own grandmother had described something similar from the old country. A half-buried dwelling meant to survive winters that lasted longer than any wood frame house could reasonably endure, built not because it was elegant, but because it worked. There was no lumber to spare for a proper cabin repair, not with the money owed to the bank, and no time to order milled boards from the county seat before the ground froze solid. There was, however, a hillside that already knew things about wind and cold that Agnes was only beginning to understand. She decided, on a gray morning in early October, that she would not fight the coming winter with green lumber and hope. She would dig into the ground the wind could not reach, and let the hill itself do the work no cabin wall had ever quite managed. She did not yet know how badly the first attempt would fail, or how close that failure would come to costing her the one advantage the hillside had already given her for free. Word of Agnes Kellerman's plan reached the church congregation before she had turned over more than a few shovelfuls of prairie sod, the way news of anything unusual tends to outrun the thing itself in a small county. Harold Voss brought it up after the Sunday service, standing near the wagons with a handful of other men, in a tone that was meant to sound like concern, but carried an edge of something closer to satisfaction. He said he had ridden past the Kellerman place and seen the widow marking out a trench along the eastern hillside, and that as far as he could tell she intended to live in a hole in the ground like the old sod house settlers 2 generations back, or worse, like the native families who had lived on these plains long before any of them had arrived. He did not say it unkindly, exactly. He said it the way a man says something he considers simply factual, unaware or unconcerned that factual and respectful are not always the same thing. Reverend Whitcomb, to his credit, tried to temper the conversation, saying only that a widow facing a hard winter deserved patience rather than judgment, and that whatever shelter kept the boy warm and fed was no business for scorn. But even his defense carried an undertone of pity, the sense that Agnes was doing something desperate rather than something deliberate. And pity, Agnes would later reflect, can sting nearly as much as mockery when it comes from someone who has never once had to dig his own shelter into frozen ground. Elsie Voss said nothing in front of the other men. She had ridden past the Kellerman place herself that week, on her own, without telling Harold, and had stood at the edge of the property for a long while, watching Agnes and young Peter working the trench with a borrowed spade and a shovel with a cracked handle. She had not offered to help. She had not been sure, watching, whether help was what Agnes wanted, or whether the widow needed more than anything else to prove to herself that she could do this without anyone's permission. By the following Sunday, the story had grown the way stories do in small counties with long winters and short amusements. Some said Agnes Kellerman was digging her own grave early to save the county the trouble later. Others said she had lost her senses entirely after her husband's death, and ought to be looked after by someone with better judgment, meaning, more often than not, someone like Harold Voss. Agnes heard some of this secondhand, through Peter, who repeated things other children said without fully understanding their weight, and some of it directly, through the careful silence that fell over certain conversations whenever she entered the general store. She said nothing in her own defense. She had already decided that the argument she needed to win was not with her neighbors, but with the ground itself, and with a winter that was now less than 6 weeks away. The first cut into the hillside came on a morning cold enough that Agnes could see her own breath before she had lifted a single shovelful of earth, and warm enough still that the ground had not yet frozen solid against her. She and Peter worked with tools that belonged to the wrong job more often than the right one. A spade with a handle worn smooth from years of use on softer soil, a shovel with a crack running halfway up its handle that Agnes bound with wire each morning before starting, and a mattock borrowed from Reverend Whitcomb that was better suited to breaking rock than cutting sod. The plan, as much as Agnes had one written down anywhere, existed mostly in her memory of her grandmother's descriptions, and in her own careful observation of how the hillside behaved through 2 full weeks of frost. She would cut a chamber directly into the eastern slope, roughly 12 feet across and perhaps 10 feet deep, leaving the hill itself to form the back wall and both sides. Only the front, facing away from the worst of the wind, would need to be built up separately, along with whatever roof would need to span the open space. The digging itself was slower than she expected, and harder on Peter's small hands than she liked to admit. The boy worked without complaint most mornings, hauling loosened earth away in a wheelbarrow that was nearly as tall as he was, though by the second week his hands had begun to blister badly enough that Agnes wrapped them in strips of cloth each evening before he went to bed. What she had not accounted for, in all her studying of frost patterns and wind direction, was how much labor the roof itself would demand. A proper earth lodge roof needed a frame strong enough to bear the weight of a foot or more of packed sod and soil, built from timber she did not have and could not afford to buy. What she had instead was a stand of young cottonwood and willow along the creek bank, flexible enough to bend into something resembling a frame, but far weaker than seasoned timber, and she knew it even as she cut the first branches. She built the frame anyway, weaving the thinner branches between the thicker poles, the way she had once seen a basket woven, layering grass and reeds across the gaps before adding the first covering of sod. It was not elegant. It was, she told herself, a beginning, and beginnings rarely looked like anything worth admiring. By the 3rd week of October, the chamber was cut, the frame stood, and the first layer of sod had been laid across the roof, thick clumps of prairie grass turned root side up, the way she remembered her grandmother describing it, so the living roots would eventually knit themselves together into something solid. Agnes stood at the entrance one evening, looking at the low mound rising from the hillside, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, something close to relief. The relief did not last through the next rain. The rain came on a Thursday night in late October, heavier and longer than any storm the county had seen that autumn, the kind of rain farmers usually welcomed before a hard winter, and just as often regretted when it arrived all at once instead of gradually. Agnes woke sometime after midnight to a sound she did not immediately recognize, a low, groaning shift of weight settling somewhere above her, followed almost immediately by a section of the ceiling near the entrance giving way entirely. It was not a total collapse. She would remind herself of that fact many times in the days afterward, the way a person clings to the smaller mercy inside a larger disaster. The back 2/3 of the roof held, the section cut most deeply into the hill itself, supported by ground that had never needed her willow frame to begin with. But the front section, the part she had built up from cottonwood branches too green and too weak to bear a foot of soaked earth, gave way under the combined weight of rain-heavy sod and 3 days of accumulated soil. The collapse came down directly onto the small storage alcove, where she had kept the family's remaining tools, burying the mattock, the good spade, and nearly all of Peter's carefully wrapped kindling under several 100 pounds of wet earth and broken willow branches. Peter, thankfully, had been sleeping further back, in the deeper section of the chamber that held firm. He woke to the sound and the sudden draft of cold, wet air rushing in through the new gap in the roof, and Agnes found him sitting upright in the dark, not crying, but very still, the way children go still when they are trying to determine whether something is truly dangerous or merely loud. They spent the remaining hours before dawn moving what dry bedding they could find to the back of the chamber, away from the new opening, while cold rain continued to find its way in through the collapsed section and pool along what had, until a few hours earlier, been a dry dirt floor. By first light, Agnes stood outside in the drizzle, looking at the damage, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not despair exactly, though there was plenty of that available if she wanted it, but a colder, clearer kind of anger directed entirely at herself. She had built the weakest part of the roof over the section she needed most. The entrance, the place where a person actually had to pass beneath the structure every single day. The collapse had not proven her grandmother's method wrong. It had proven, quite specifically, that green cottonwood branches could not carry the weight that seasoned timber or, better still, the undisturbed hillside itself could carry without complaint. She would need to dig the entrance section deeper into the slope, sacrificing space but gaining the same solid ground that had held firm through the storm. Or she would need to find timber strong enough to do what the willow frame could not. Either choice would cost her time she had already been short on before the collapse, and winter, she reminded herself standing in the cold morning rain, had not agreed to wait for her to get the design right. It was Fritz, in the end, who showed Agnes the mistake she had been too close to see herself. In the days following the collapse, while Agnes and Peter cleared away the ruined section of roof and salvaged what tools they could dig free from the wet earth, the old dog kept returning to a particular spot along the undamaged rear wall of the chamber, scratching at the base of it in short, insistent bursts before losing interest and wandering off, only to return an hour later and do the same thing again. Agnes ignored the behavior for the better part of 2 days, assuming the dog had simply caught the scent of a mole or a ground squirrel disturbed by all the digging. It was Peter who finally pointed out, on the 3rd day, that Fritz never actually tried to dig through the wall itself, only along the base of it, in a shallow trench that ran the width of the chamber. Agnes knelt down that afternoon and studied the spot more closely than she had allowed herself to before. The rear wall, the section cut directly into the undisturbed hillside, showed almost no water damage at all, despite the storm that had soaked everything else. Running her hand along the base of that wall, she noticed something the collapse had distracted her from seeing. A faint but definite groove worn into the earth, following the natural slope of the hill exactly, carrying whatever moisture accumulated during the rain away from the chamber and down toward a shallow gully further along the property line. The hillside had been managing its own water long before she had ever cut into it. The undisturbed slope, with its natural pitch and the packed density of soil that had never been disturbed, shed water along a path it had clearly followed for years, perhaps longer. Her willow-framed entrance, by contrast, sat at a slightly different angle, one that happened to collect rainwater instead of shedding it, funneling the worst of the storm directly toward the one section of roof least equipped to bear the weight. It was not a mystical insight. It was, she would later describe it to Peter, in far simpler words than she used in her own thinking, a matter of listening to ground that already knew where water wanted to go, rather than insisting it go somewhere more convenient for her. She redesigned the entrance that week, cutting it deeper into the slope than her original plan, following the same natural angle that had kept the rear wall dry, and adding a shallow drainage channel along the outside of the doorway that mirrored the groove Fritz had been scratching at all along. The dog, for his part, seemed entirely uninterested in the credit, and returned to sleeping against the rear wall each night, as though nothing about the arrangement had ever been in question. Agnes did not entirely trust the correction yet. She had trusted the first design, too, right up until the moment it failed. But she trusted the hillside's own pattern more than she trusted her own judgment now. And that, she told herself, was at least a start toward getting this right before the real cold arrived. The first real test came in the second week of November, an early season storm that dropped nearly 8 inches of snow across the county over 2 days, accompanied by winds strong enough to rattle the windows of every wood frame house for 20 miles in either direction. Agnes and Peter spent that storm inside the rebuilt earth lodge, the entrance now cut deep enough into the slope to match the natural drainage of the hillside. The roof rebuilt with the strongest cottonwood poles she could find, cut thicker and braced more heavily than her first attempt, and reinforced along the weakest span with stones salvaged from the collapsed section of the old cabin. What surprised her most that first night was not that the shelter held against the wind, though it did, holding firm even as she could hear the storm working at every loose shutter on the Voss property a half-mile distant. What surprised her was how warm the chamber remained, hours after she had let the small fire in the corner hearth burn down to little more than embers. She had expected the earth walls to block the wind. She had not fully anticipated how much of the day's heat the packed soil itself would hold, releasing it slowly back into the chamber long after any wood frame wall would have gone cold. By the second morning of the storm, with snow still falling outside, Peter was complaining not about the cold, but about being too warm in the wool blanket Agnes had given him the night before. It was, in its own quiet way, the first real proof that the hillside was doing exactly what her grandmother had always claimed it would. But the storm revealed something else as well, something less reassuring. On the second night, as the wind shifted direction sometime after dark, Agnes noticed a thin haze building near the ceiling of the chamber, smoke from the hearth fire that should have been drawing upward and outward through the narrow vent she had cut near the roofline, but was instead curling back down into the room itself. By the time she noticed it clearly enough to act, both she and Peter had begun coughing, and the boy's eyes had gone red and watery in the dim firelight. She doused the fire immediately and forced open the entrance despite the driving snow outside, letting the cold air scour the smoke from the chamber even as it undid, in a matter of minutes, most of the warmth the earth walls had spent all day storing. It was, she understood, standing in that sudden rush of freezing air, a genuine failure, not of the walls or the roof, but of the one detail she had given the least thought to, the exact path smoke needed in order to leave a shelter this well sealed against the wind. A structure good enough to keep out a blizzard, she realized, was also good enough to trap the very smoke a person needed to survive one. Unless the ventilation was built with as much care as everything else, she had solved one problem only to discover the shelter's real vulnerability had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, waiting for the wind to shift just enough to expose it. Agnes rebuilt the ventilation shaft twice before she trusted it, working through the final weeks of November with a patience that had less to do with confidence and more to do with having no other option worth considering. The first vent, the one that had failed during the November storm, ran straight up through the roof at the shortest possible distance, which had seemed sensible enough on paper, but proved disastrous the moment the wind shifted to blow directly across the opening instead of past it. Her second attempt angled the shaft slightly, catching a lesson she half remembered from her grandmother about chimneys back in the old country, that smoke needed a path shaped less like a straight tube and more like a gentle bend, one that let rising heat continue upward even when wind outside tried to push back down against it. She tested the new vent on calm days first, then deliberately during a lesser wind, watching the smoke from small test fires to see whether it climbed steadily or hesitated and curled back towards the room. By early December, after her third adjustment, the smoke rose and stayed risen, even when she opened the door wide enough to create a deliberate draft. She did not have much time to feel satisfied about it. The same week she finished the vent, word reached the county of a storm system building far to the west, larger and slower moving than anything the older ranchers could recall in recent years, the kind of system that got discussed at the general store in careful, lowered voices rather than the usual complaints about weather. And the same week that news arrived, so did a letter from the county bank, informing Agnes that the balance remaining on equipment her late husband had purchased was now considered due in full, given what the letter's dry language called changed circumstances regarding the property's future use. Agnes understood well enough what changed circumstances meant. Harold Voss had likely mentioned, in whatever conversation men like him had with men at the bank, that the widow Kellerman seemed unlikely to make a success of that hillside dwelling, and that the land might be more securely managed under new ownership before winter fully set in. She did not have the money the bank wanted, not before spring, not without selling something she could not currently afford to sell. What she had instead was a storm coming that would, one way or another, settle the argument about her hillside far more convincingly than any letter from the county seat. She spent the final days before the storm's arrival hauling in extra firewood, checking the drainage channel along the entrance one final time, and teaching Peter exactly what to do if the vent ever choked with smoke again, which door to open, which direction to move the bedding, how to stay low near the floor, where the air stayed clearest longest. She did not know yet how thoroughly that lesson would be tested, or how close the coming days would come to proving both her worst fear and her quiet hope correct at exactly the same time. The storm arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December and did not fully release its hold on the county for 3 days, dropping snow that drifted, in places, higher than a grown man's shoulders, and driving temperatures down to levels the oldest ranchers in the area struggled to recall from any recent winter. Across the county, the storm exposed weaknesses that had gone unnoticed through milder years. The Voss Ranch, for all its size and relative wealth, lost 11 head of cattle to the cold and drifting snow. Animals that had wandered too far from the main barn before the worst of the storm closed in, and Harold spent the better part of the second night out searching for stock he would not fully account for until the snow finally cleared. Elsie kept the fire in their farmhouse going through both nights, but admitted afterward that the northeast bedroom had grown cold enough that she moved the children's bedding into the main room entirely, layering quilts against a wall that never seemed to hold heat the way it should have. The Whitcomb family fared little better, their parsonage drafty enough that the Reverend spent both nights feeding the stove almost continuously, sleeping in short stretches near the fire, rather than risk the fuel running low while everyone slept. Inside the earth lodge, the first night passed with what Agnes would later describe, carefully, as manageable difficulty rather than any true crisis. The walls held their heat as they had during the November test, releasing warmth slowly back into the chamber even through hours when the fire burned low. Peter slept soundly enough that Agnes found herself, more than once, checking simply to reassure herself he was only sleeping, and not something worse. The second night was different. Sometime after midnight, the wind that had been blowing steadily from the northwest for nearly 30 hours shifted, swinging around unexpectedly to strike the hillside from a new angle entirely, one that pushed directly across the newly angled vent shaft Agnes had spent weeks perfecting. She woke to the smell of smoke before she woke to any sound, a faint but unmistakable haze already gathering near the ceiling by the time her eyes adjusted to the dark. And beside her, in the small space where he had been sleeping soundly only hours before, Peter had begun to cough. The cough was small at first, the kind of dry, irritated sound a child makes when smoke first reaches the back of the throat. Nothing yet that suggested real danger. Agnes had heard exactly this sound once before, during the November storm, and she moved now with the same instinct that failure had taught her, reaching for the door before she had even fully separated the fact of the wind shift from the fact of her son coughing beside her. But the door, this time, offered no easy answer. Opening it fully, as she had during the earlier test, would clear the smoke in minutes, but it would also undo, in that same span of minutes, every hour of stored warmth. The earth walls had built up across 2 days of brutal cold. Warmth, she was not certain the shelter could rebuild quickly enough, given how deeply the temperature outside had fallen. Leaving the vent as it was risked, the smoke thickening further before the wind shifted again, an outcome with no guaranteed timeline attached to it at all. Agnes chose a middle path, one she had not specifically planned for, but which drew directly on everything the hillside itself had already taught her since October. She opened the door only part way, just enough to create a controlled draft rather than a full one, angling a spare board across the gap to redirect the incoming cold air upward toward the ceiling, following roughly the same path the smoke itself needed to escape. At the same time, she moved Peter down low, near the floor, exactly as she had taught him weeks earlier, where the air remained clearest even as haze gathered higher up in the chamber. It was not a perfect solution. She could feel the temperature in the room falling steadily even as the smoke began, slowly, to thin near the ceiling. Peter's cough continued for several long minutes, though it did not worsen, and Agnes found herself counting his breaths in the dark the way she had once counted the days of her husband's fever, trying to convince herself that counting something gave her some measure of control over an outcome she could not fully see. The wind held its new direction for nearly 2 hours before shifting back, sometime before dawn, toward the northwest pattern it had held for most of the storm. The moment it did, the smoke that had gathered near the ceiling began drawing properly upward again through the vent, clearing the chamber steadily, until by the time the gray light of the third morning reached the hillside, the air inside had gone clean again, and Peter's breathing had settled into the slow, even rhythm of a child, finally, truly asleep. Agnes did not sleep herself until well after sunrise. She sat instead near the entrance, watching the last of the storm's snow tapering off outside, and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 days, to consider seriously that she and her son might come through this storm, not merely alive, but essentially unharmed, in a shelter that half the county had called foolish only 2 months before. The storm broke fully by mid-morning on the third day, leaving behind a silence so complete that Agnes could hear individual clumps of snow sliding from the cottonwoods along the creek, before she heard anything resembling human voices approaching. The voices, when they came, belonged to Harold Voss and 2 other men from neighboring farms, riding out along a trail they had to break freshly through drifted snow, expecting, by their own later admission, to find considerably worse than what they found. They had come, in part, to check on a widow they assumed had likely suffered the worst of the storm, and in part, though none of them said this aloud at the time, because the bank's letter demanding payment on Wilhelm's old equipment debt had made its way through enough of the county's quiet channels that a few people had begun to feel uneasy about how that pressure had been timed. What they found instead was smoke rising steadily from the low hillside mound, a shoveled path already cut from the door toward the yard, and Peter outside, despite the cold, packing snow into a rough shape that might eventually become something recognizable, laughing at some private joke, with a freedom that suggested nothing about the previous 3 days had frightened him, nearly as much as the grown men standing at the top of the ridge had feared it might. Harold Voss stood at the edge of the property for a long moment before dismounting. He did not apologize outright that first morning for the things he had said back in October, and Agnes did not expect him to. What he did instead was ask, in a tone considerably quieter than the one he had used at church 2 months earlier, how the shelter had actually managed the second night's wind, admitting, without much preamble, that his own family's northeast bedroom had gone cold enough to worry him. Agnes told him plainly, without embellishment or triumph, about the vent shaft's angle, about the drainage channel that mirrored the hillside's own natural slope, about the mistake with the first roof and the correction that followed. She did not mention the letter from the bank, and neither that morning did he. Word of the Earth Lodge's performance through the storm spread through the county considerably faster than the mockery had spread back in October, though Agnes noticed, without much surprise, that people were generally quieter about admitting they had been wrong than they had been about assuming she was foolish in the first place. Elsie Voss visited twice in the following weeks, openly this time, asking careful questions about drainage angles and roof pitch. Questions Agnes answered without hesitation, having decided somewhere during that second long night that whatever advantage the hillside had given her was worth more shared than hoarded. The bank's letter, as it happened, was quietly extended after Reverend Whitcomb made a visit to the county seat on Agnes's behalf, a visit prompted in part by Harold Voss himself, who found it considerably harder to press for a widow's land once half the county understood how thoroughly her judgment had outperformed his own. Agnes never did fix the pocket watch stopped at 17 minutes past 4. It remained on the shelf near the hearth of the Earth Lodge through that winter and several after it, not as a wound she kept reopening, but as a small, quiet marker of a life that had once gone one direction before turning, unexpectedly, into another. The shelter had never truly been about defeating the storm. It had only ever been about giving the wind fewer places left to take anything from her. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.